You can't keep getting away with it! He can't keep getting away with it!
Can't he though? Are you sure it's not you who's the problem, pal? Are you sure it's not you blowing up your own infrastructure, threatening yourself with nuclear terrorism, sabotaging your own grain exports? No. Let me both side it real quick for the New York Times opinion piece and go island hopping in Greece.
Yeah, this is gonna help big time with that! Bitch!
I am very unbiased, which is a virtue and not at all a symptom of daunting indecisiveness plaguing our entire civilization. Hello from Ukraine, everyone, and welcome to the new installation of the Circus of the Russian Blackmail, the Kremlin Earth Goblin Chapiteau. How wonderful is that? How thrilling.
You just have to say that you're fine when you're not.
They are threatening the world with starvation unless Putin gets swift access to pay for the western parts of his missiles. I mean, he's already buying the western parts for his missiles, but he would like for it to be easier. He's unhappy with customer service. He would like the next day door delivery. And the fact that you guys refuse to provide him with that is actually very offensive and borderline Russophobic. So why is Russia threatening the world with starvation now? I thought last time we checked in with Putin and co, they were threatening us with nuclear annihilation. What changed? This, of course, has to do with the grain deal between Russia and Ukraine, a plan originally brokered by the United Nations with active involvement from Turkey, and it was meant to prevent Russia from attacking everything that had to do with Ukrainian grain export infrastructure, ports, ships, and grain storages. And in return, Russia gets some of the Western sanctions lifted. Why would Russia need any of the Western sanctions lifted? I'm a huge Russia stan, and Russia Today told me that the Western sanctions aren't actually doing anything. Shh, 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 it's okay. Log off. Okay. To overly simplify the very nature of this deal, it was the Russian blackmail that worked. Because absolutely nothing in the world justifies Russian attacks against Ukrainian port infrastructure, or ships with grain, or storages with grain, or anything that has to do with Ukrainian grain. Nothing excuses Russia stealing millions of tons of Ukrainian grain from the occupied territories and selling it abroad and feeding it to one of its pocket dictators from a shovel. They even stole the tractors. And what they couldn't steal, they burned. You know what it sounds like? It sounds like exactly the type of people that we all should be talking to more. In fact, let's sign a deal with them to protect global food security. And here's a catch, let's also spend a year and a half not trying to come up with any alternative plan. Brilliant. Just appoint me as the UN and call it a day. Instead of coming up with an alternative plan, let's put all of our eggs, aka grain, in a basket carried by a rabid goblin with shaky hangover hands, and then manifest good vibes only for the 50 million tons of grain. Obviously, this attitude is not at all emblematic of how the world has been treating the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine since day one. What do you mean you could have brokered Russia into not shelling some of our infrastructure? Could you maybe have done the same for the rest of our infrastructure? Huh? UN? No? We kinda spent an entire winter with no power because of Russians striking our power grid. No. Got it. Thank you, the United Nations. An organization that can do a lot of things. But will it though? And the deal itself was not even about preventing the attacks. Russians have hit Odessa the day after the first grain deal was signed. So what was it actually about? It was seeking to postpone the strikes. It basically told the Ukrainians, some part of you are gonna get bombed and some won't, because those are the parts that directly affect me. So the wonderful deal carved by the gods of geopolitics ended up caving into the Russian blackmail by virtually legitimizing Russian presence and control over the Ukrainian Black Sea coast. and thus gave the Kremlin what they love most, an illusion of power, an illusion of being the danger to African kids, being the one who knocks down ships with food. And Ukraine was in no position to choose. We were cornered into this deal by not having enough military capacity to deal with Russian aggression in the Black Sea region. Shout out to the Ukraine disarmament gang that took away all of our long-range weapons in the 90s and early 2000s. I know I was only 3 when it happened, but God, I wish I could go back in time and boss baby karate chop you out of existence. And unfortunately, for the same reason, we still do not have enough military capacity to tackle the danger to the very security architecture of the Black Sea region, the occupied Sevastopol-based Russian Black Sea Fleet. That's the fleet they use for many awful things. At least for now. The world already knows that the Black Sea Fleet is not invincible, so what's stopping us? I know what's stopping us. So after the deal was signed, tons of grain, more specifically 30 million tons of Ukrainian grain, ended up leaving ports of Odessa and Odessa region. This helped boost Ukrainian economy, which can be best described as it was not doing well before the war, but just as we thought we've reached the bottom, we heard the knock from underneath. And for international markets, it meant relative stabilization. Ukraine used to supply the world with roughly 45 million tons of grain per year, and even minor deficit in supply can cause a shift in the prices, which will primarily be felt by the countries that already suffer from food insecurity. Despite the little philanthropic cosplay that the Kremlin did, trying to pretend like their goals are all about the grain and helping the global south and feeding the poor and downtrodden, the Kremlin never really does anything without the benefit for the Kremlin. So how did Russia benefit from the grain deal? An interesting piece of trivia here is that they kind of didn't. Well, at least according to the psychotic Russian pro-war crowds, also known as the Russian patriots. They repeatedly pointed out that Russia never has gotten anything of actual significance from the deal, aka nothing that could actually heavily influence the war action, the only thing that the pro-war Russians care about, while still continuing to sign the deal, which was perceived by these people as deeply humiliating and ultimately useless. Perhaps this has something to do with the fact that the key beneficiaries of the grain deal, just like the key beneficiaries of most of the Russian wealth, are like 30 people closest to Putin, aka Putin's inner circle. The conditions needed in order to continue the grain deal that Russia mentioned publicly had to do with the sales of Russian fertilizer and sanctions lifted from one of the Russian bank, the Russian agricultural bank, Rossельхозbank. Rossельхозbank, up until 2018, was headed by Dmitry Patrushev, the son of Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Nikolai Patrushev. The same son in question is currently serving in the Russian Ministry of Agriculture. So I believe we can kind of guess which particular family from the Putin's inner circle is benefiting from the grain deal more than the others. As you can see, many things about the grain deal were quite flaky and stink of temporary solution because, well, for once you cannot solve a deal of such a scale without addressing the root issue. And in this case, it was the Russian aggression. The Russian aggression that led to the blackmail being possible in the first place. And nobody wants to deal with the Russian aggression except for the Ukrainian army that has no other choice. In fact, allow me to be a petty Crimean and point out to the little fact that the direct cause of this issue that we're currently facing originated in the year 2014, when Crimea was annexed by the Russian Federation. This issue was largely pushed to the side by the global community because business as usual with Russia was considered to be more important. Ukrainian control over Sevastopol created this perfect balance between good and evil. So if Sevastopol was still under Ukrainian control, this would never have happened. Add this to your summer playlist. How about that? However, you choose to make a grain deal with the devil. Don't be surprised when the devil decides to quit the deal on July 18th, 2023, citing failure of the signees to meet the Russian requirement. Blackmail. It's called blackmail. The Kremlin threatened consequences for anyone i.e. Ukraine, because we are their punching bag for some reason, that attempts to move on with the grain exports without Russia participating in it. And that was the moment of truth. Is there anyone in the global community willing to do anything about the grain terrorism? Anyone willing to challenge the aggressor and provide guarantees for the Ukrainian grain? Anyone willing to save the world? Anyone willing to feed the poor? No. No one. Got it, thank you. Zelensky openly called on to the partners, namely Turkey and the UN, to continue with the deal regardless of what the Planet of the Apes has had to say, but received silence in return. The world remains scared. I mean concerned. The world remained concerned. But wait, leave it to the United Nations to make things worse. When I saw that statement for the first time, I wanted to throw myself off the cliff. UN Chief Guterres basically admitted to being all oiled up and ready to cave into the Russian blackmail. And to, quote-unquote, to find dedicated solutions across the banking and private sectors and to build a bespoke payments mechanism for the Russian Agricultural Bank outside the SWIFT international banking network. How are you gonna do that outside the SWIFT system? Huh? The UN, the only organization in the world that pretends to feed Africa, but is actually feeding the Patrushev family instead. Was it a sign to Russia that the only hurdle on their way to getting Rossельхозbank SWIFT access was Ukraine? We'll never know, but they definitely interpret it like this, beginning a series of attacks against the city of Odessa. Odessa and Odessa region has been deliberately targeted in the Russian missile strikes for days now. At the time of the recording, the strikes continue for the 5th day in a row, targeting the ports, burning 60,000 tons of grain in one go. Just FYI, 60,000 tons of grain is enough to feed roughly 270,000 people for a year. Russians burned it in one night. They destroy agricultural equipment and they injure people. The underwhelming response from the global community left Ukraine baffled. I mean, it's one thing when the mainstream media says nothing when it's just, our lives and health that are at stake. But this is literally a global issue. It's gonna affect you. Yes, you. I'm sorry for pointing. Probably they didn't say anything because you cannot both side this issue. I mean, the New York Times opinion piece on why is Ukraine bombing itself with the Onyx missiles that they don't even have doesn't exactly write itself. I imagine it was the abysmal response, among other things, that led to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense announcing that any and all Russian ships that try to enter the occupied Ukrainian ports or the Russian ports through the Black Sea will be considered military targets. A long time coming symmetrical response to what the Russians have already proclaimed before. Has anyone both-sided that yet? No, come on. Come on, I know you wanna do it. New York Times, I can see it in your eyes. Wall Street Journal, no. Reuters, oh Reuters, you do love the Russian point of view, don't you? Fox News. Okay, maybe not Fox News, but anyone else? Cover it just like the Dam. I know you want to. Okay, so what do we do? What options do we have? How can we possibly go around this issue? So there's option number one, which I call pulling a UN. It means agreeing to the Russian blackmail conditions, both the public and the private ones, and thus risking to prolong the war to which there is already seemingly no end, especially taking into the account all of the tanks and planes dangling we have been witnessing for the past year. But this could further exacerbate it, adding to the Russia's already abundant war budget and potential ways to circumvent the sanctions. Rossельхозbank would become the 5th Russian bank that is not under sanctions. Yes, 4 of the Russian banks still have SWIFT access. One of them is the Gazprom Bank, which is the bank used for the fossil fuel payments from the European Union and others. And it's also the bank that they used to pay their military their salary. How fun is that? Considering the overall trends of this war and the world's response to this war, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the option we would end up with. So yeah, chances are this is actually going to happen. And option number 2, pulling a Zelensky and moving on with the deal without Russia, seemed valid at the beginning, but it's currently losing points live on Maine with every new Russian missile strike against Odessa and region. Possibly one of the reasons for this intensified strikes, to show to the world that nah, you cannot go on with the deal without me. With every new port and every grain storage set on fire by the Russian missiles, this proposition is losing its validity. What business would risk sending their precious ships into the port that looks like a burning inferno? And what insurance companies would agree to work with grain exporters from hell? And option number 3 would involve looking at the potential land routes for the grain export, which would include sending Ukrainian trucks and trains through the neighboring EU NATO countries, and ideally ending up in the European ports for further export. Not only does this mean the rising cost of the grain, excruciating lines for the truck drivers, and still lesser quantities exported because nothing can replace the ship, it's also a measure extremely unpopular among our neighbors, more specifically the neighboring countries' farmers, because the grain tends to not necessarily make it to the ports, but rather it tends to spread among the local market, delivering a devastating blow to the local markets because Ukrainian grain is much cheaper than what the local farmers are charging for their grain. This problem, although complex, presents a much easier one to solve than the Russian missiles we have no way of stopping, striking you. But try telling it to the Ukrainian and Polish officials currently having a populist showdown on all kinds of media. You might have noticed that the problem is not the grain itself, it's the lack of mechanism that would regulate it. However, coming up with a solution is hard, and throwing a temper tantrum on Twitter is much more fun. The same goes for demanding an embargo. Could UN try and broker a deal between Shmyhal and Morawiecki? Can we send them on a date in space? Or maybe on a submersible of some kind? I'm just saying. And then there is an option number 4, and I call it waking up. Waking up to realize that we're dealing with a blackmailing terrorist. And if you respond to terror with fear, you will receive nothing but disgrace. The recent decision by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense to mirror the Russian threats and consider every Russian ship entering the Black Sea waters as a potential military target introduces a framework for a possible future solution. A solution not only for the grain deal, but for the future security of all of the Black Sea region. The Black Sea fleet of the Russian Federation must burn. And the sooner we come to terms with this, the easier it will be when it finally does. And it will burn, because without it burning, the very architecture of the Black Sea region security will be jeopardized. Can you truly have a safe region with a bunch of lunatics shelling your ports indiscriminately and threatening the whole planet with famine? Without the Black Sea fleet being gone, Crimea will never be liberated. And without Crimea liberated, a threat of a further Russian invasion will forever be in the air, because the lines of the international law will forever remain blurred for our region, and the justice will not be served. And we deserve justice. Burn the fleet, save the kids. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is currently carrying not only all of us Ukrainian civilians, but all of the European security and the very idea of the law-based order against the unspeakable horrors of the Russian aggression on their shoulders. By donating to Back in the Life, the Ukrainian non-government organization that has been helping the army since 2014, you're not only helping our guys to actually come back home alive, you are contributing to the cerebral war ending sooner, for the war will only be over when the last one of the Russian invaders is kicked out of Ukraine. The link to the fund will be in the video description. If you'd like to hear more from me, you can find me on my other platforms, usually yelling at someone on Twitter, and my biggest, warmest, heartfelt gratitude goes to all of my patrons on Patreon, without whom this video would not have been made. See you later, alligator.